quality of the policy advice function is critical for government to be able to do its business. It's without the role of policy analysts, ministers won't have that balanced advice that tells them, what the evidence is all about, weighs up the risks, introduces what the costs might be, and also pushes things through with legislation. Government basically can't do its business without policy advice. But the context in which we're operating as policy analysts is changing. It's becoming more complicated, and with greater exposure to information through developments in technology, citizens, businesses are expecting to be much more involved in decisions that are affecting them. Now, we've observed a bit of a quiet revolution on the service delivery front, where services are moving much more agilely into understanding what users of services want. I'm talking about government services here, and are trying very hard to be working in partnership with users of services to deliver much more effective government services. And our thesis is that the policy world is a little bit behind the 8 ball on this. We think we can get with the program and do this better. The policy system isn't fundamentally broken. There's a lot that we do at the core of it that is excellent, but we think that there's more that can be done to make us more agile and responsive to expectations. Like a good policy project, we sort of did some analysis. We scanned what information we could to find out, well, what is the lie of the land. In fact, really good information is very hard to find about our policy workforce, who we are, what the profile is, even how we count the number of people that we regard as policy analysts. Past reviews, and there have been quite a few of them done over more than 20 years, have tended to reiterate the same kinds of message about what the issues are with policy analysis. Overall, just synthesising those past reviews, same old story that you're probably familiar with. Quality varies. There's a shortage of skilled analysts. The use of evidence and evaluation can be much improved. We're responsive, highly responsive, and we're very reactive, but we're not very good, and this is shown in PIF reviews as well, we're not very good at taking that much longer view and picking up on the stewardship element. And we're still, despite constant exhortations, we're still pretty weak at working right across government. I'm just going to take you through, and I don't want to sound overly negative, but again, with the analysis that we did, I'll just take you through different facets of what we saw as the current state. So, because policy work is a knowledge industry, the capability of our people is critical. Without skilled minds and other associated skill sets that you bring to the policy enterprise, we're not going to do our jobs well. What we found is that there's no common view of what a really great analyst, senior analyst, principal analyst really looks like, or for that matter, a great policy manager or a policy deputy secretary. It's very, very hard to compare skills right across agencies in the public sector, in the policy world, because there are many different job descriptions and competency sets that go with those. As Sally said, depending on how you count the policy workforce, we don't really know how many people to include in what we call the policy workforce. Does, for instance, ministerial servicing, which is often done out of a policy team, but not always across the different departments, does that count as part of the policy effort or not? So it starts to affect how you even count that workforce. In terms of our talent, and that's really what's critical here, in talking with policy leaders around town, for them the biggest pain point is attracting policy talent. And what we tend to do is draw from within the public service. There's not a lot of drawing in from local government or necessarily from the private sector, so it's a bit of a go-round, and we're drawing in the same people, competing with each other for the same people. So you start to see salaries ratcheting up, and you also start to see people shopping around to be appointed into the more senior role, and because of that competition, some dismay that some people get appointed when they're not necessarily considered to be ready by some of their peers. We've got a top-heavy workforce profile. Again, using the HRC data, we've been able to ascertain that what you might have thought would be a traditional, more of a pyramid model with fewer and fewer people as you get more senior, so you'd expect to see more people at the graduate and analyst level. In fact, it's inverted almost. It's more like a diamond shape, in fact, with most of our policy workforce, as far as we can count them, at that more senior analyst level. This presents a problem because we've got quite sporadic attempts at graduate intake programs. Some people do them well, some people have done them very badly, some people don't do them at all. And if we're not bringing the talent in, and we're sort of buying our senior experienced people from within a limited pool, we've got a pipeline problem. We're not getting the flow in and then through the system. So one of the things that we're concerned about is that we're buying our talent, we're not growing that talent. Also, in terms of just still talking about the current state, the products and services, what we've found is departments are working in complete isolation of each other mostly to develop up their own quality frameworks. There's no really common understanding of what great policy advice looks like. A lot of us use the NZPSA assessment across our cabinet papers, but in fact policy processes are much wider than what we do to deliver a cabinet paper. There's no joined up effort in relation to training or development of our policy staff. We've thought, for instance, it would be useful to start to understand what people are using, how they rate it, and even introduce something like you get a trip advisor when you're looking to book hotels or something overseas. Maybe we can actually instigate something like a trip advisor for people's experiences of different kinds of training programs, so that you start to get more of a shared understanding of what's available and how to rate it. We've got a pretty limited ability to match the supply, to put the resources where they're really needed. So we see some policy shops run frantically off their feet, and others seem to be resourced more comfortably, and there's not that same frenetic pressure. But we don't seem to be very good at shifting the resources to where we might really want them to be. And that's that lack of taking a system view to the way in which we're running what for a better term I call the policy enterprise. So the approach that we've taken in the policy project is very much about having an impact through influence. This is not a central agency top-down initiative where we decide in that sort of slightly arrogant way that you can sometimes see with central agencies. We know what's best, you're doing it all wrong, we're going to rescue you, tell you how to do it right. That is not the approach that we want to take. So we've started right from the outset by drawing in the policy leaders, by listening to them and asking them what their pain points are, what are they struggling with, then supplementing that with additional information to help provide a little bit of an evidence base in what is a fairly patchy evidence field. And for nearly a year now, next month is 12 months when Sally joined the policy project in my group, we've been going around and meeting with all of the policy teams and seeing what they're doing, trying to see who's doing great stuff, what are their what are the frameworks they're developing, what are the training programs they're thinking about, what are the things that they worry about in terms of their capability, and then starting to join people up, getting them to talk to each other and to understand better what they can learn from each other's policy shops. Quite soon, we're hoping that we will have a website that will enable much more joint communication, sharing of best practice, and collaboration on the sorts of things that really matter to those that are running different policy teams. We are co-designing some of the initiatives that I'll talk to you about very briefly. So that is drawing in from the policy teams themselves to look at some of the standards and frameworks that we think will be useful to apply across the board. We're trying to be agile and adaptive, so creating things as we go. We've got a program of work that we're running through, but we're being as adaptive as we can along the way. We're looking to build on good practice. As I said, the policy function in government isn't broken, and there are pockets of really good work. And we want that to be showcased and highlighted, so we're looking for avenues to do that. And we're taking a very collaborative approach. So we meet every 6 weeks with now a very large group of second-tier policy leaders, and people are still asking us to join, so we have said no to nobody. It's everybody around town now that is part of the second tier group. We have a subset from that group who are a small reference group for myself and Sally and our little policy project team, and we've got some chief executives who sit across the top in a more of a governance framework, sponsoring what we're doing. But it's very much a collaborative leadership effort. The second tier policy leaders are my policy champions. We need them to pick what we're doing up and reapply it back in their agencies. So that's a little bit about the kind of co-production and collaborative effort that we're taking. The policy project itself has got 4 key streams of work. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those, but what we've identified that we need to do is certainly work on the people capability side, and we're working with our second tier group and their delegates to do more work on basically a fairly high level framework for people capability, so that we can start to benchmark, you know, what really is a strong analyst, what do they look like, what are the competencies we expect of a senior analyst, a graduate analyst or a principal. We're looking at system leadership issues, so how do we ensure that we've got much more effective working across the system, because we are part of a single system, a whole system. We're looking very much at the products and services to see how we can actually get a better understanding of what quality looks like across the outputs that we produce, and also about the way in which we do our work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then the policy leadership front is kind of like a sum of all of that. Part of what we're doing is also trying to work with ministers to get them to think about those that will be willing to work with us. Not all ministers necessarily want to hear from us. To get them to think about how can they get the best out of the policy resources that are available to them, how to commission policy work effectively, and for policy leaders who are working with ministers to get them to understand the pressures that are on ministers, but also what they need to feed ministers in terms of, well, if you want this minister, we might need to reprioritise that, and how to have those sorts of conversations. So I want to take you now through, and that's a very quick tour, and I'm very happy to come back to any of those points in question time. I want to take you now to some of the thinking we're doing about how we do our policy work, and then lead you into thinking about what does that mean for the additional skills that we might need to bring to the workforce. Now, you'll all be familiar with the stages of the policy cycle. Many of you will no doubt have been involved, as I was when I was in the Ministry of Health, teaching other policy staff about these stages, what's involved. And we tended, I was guilty of this anyway, I'll speak for myself, tended to see these as discrete activities that you did, and you went through the first step, which was your problem definition, and then you went to your analysis of the policy issues and the options, thinking about the evidence along the way. You developed up your options, you consulted, which was always a fairly clinical exercise, you did your reappraisal, so on, and then right at the very end, after ministers make their decision, you might even think about building in some evaluation. A few things not too flash about that. What we're now thinking about and promoting is the idea of a dynamic policy cycle that's got evidence and insights, engagement and evaluation really sitting in the core of the other things that we do. And this is a very dynamic cycle. It's not a linear cycle. So you might start by bringing in a group of people to actually help you reframe what the problem even is. How do you define the problem? If you're looking at it through the lens of the users of particular services, you might then want to go to your evidence base and start to think about that. But it's not a linear process. It's a much more dynamic process, and we call it the inside-out process. So you're actually not just doing a clinical exercise, which is a fairly academic approach. You consult the literature and then you talk to other people a bit like yourself in other departments, and then you flick a document out and take it back in again and then reappraise your options and go to ministers. This is much more fluid, dynamic, and may lead you to some really quite interesting places which you may not have thought about if you'd stuck with more of an old school approach. It's also potentially a little bit frightening because we don't necessarily know what the citizens might think or how they might react to issues. But if you're actually applying this kind of an approach, this much more dynamic approach, you'll be able to answer Bill English when he asks you, how is this policy going to play out on the streets of Masterton? What does it mean for the people in Whangamata? What does it mean for my constituents in Gore? Because you've been engaging with citizens, you've been engaging with service delivery people, you've been engaging with the analysis and the literature and the data in a way that's going to be much, much richer. Fine in theory, I know. In the past, we've tended to also hold fairly dearly to a policy operations split, and again, I'm as guilty as others. So I used to think my job was done when the cabinet paper had been signed off by ministers, just like that, handed over to the poor people who are going to have to implement this marvellous policy that I've created. And there was a divide. We didn't really tend to talk to each other too much. We're now talking about end-to-end policy processes, and this is really a fairly rough attempt to indicate how right from the outset in your policy process you need to involve your service design, service delivery people so that you can get people thinking about implementation much, much earlier in the process. If you give them something that's completely wrapped up in a bow, and they've got to hold to the policy intent as they implement it without being involved in the thinking behind the policy work in the first place, you're going to get all sorts of skewed things happening. So this really assumes, again, as part of that dynamic policy cycle, much greater engagement with the people in your organisations who need to implement the policies that you develop. I want to talk about Agile policy services and particularly about how we add value as we go. And this is highly stylised, and I apologise for that, but it's really just a way of getting the message across. So we at one level, move from describing the world as we're seeing it, drawing in the information, through to making some analysis, leading to advice. And then through that advisory role with ministers, you start to get people moving into more of a leadership sphere, and potentially, if we're doing our jobs incredibly well, and this doesn't happen every day, you actually feel like you're transforming something. To be able to do that, and working in this end-to-end policy frame and with a dynamic policy cycle, you actually need a range of skills. And what we're saying is you need, I'm not sure if you can read these, so I'll read them out as they come up on the screen. You need people who can collate, who can synthesize, who can review. You need people who can draw on the evidence, who can evaluate, who can start to inculcate a citizen focus, who can reframe issues, quite a new art for us in the policy world. People who can broker, draw on behavioural insights, who can commission effectively, and also give free and frank advice. That's something that's a bit of a sore point. We want people who can be policy entrepreneurs, and we want stewards of the policy system. Now, this is not to say we want everybody being all these things. In a really high-performing policy team, you've got this mix amongst the people who are in your team, or you can draw that mix in as you need it. So as different issues present themselves and you think, oh, we need a different mix of people. What we've found traditionally is there's been a tendency to think everybody needs to be able to do everything, and that's really too much to ask. And the skill set that you need to do your really detailed evaluation of the evidence is a very different skill set from those who are going to be out there on the streets of Masterton or in Gore or Whangatā, engaging with citizens and reframing issues and drawing those views in. So you need a very diverse mix of skills. So this enables you to start to think about, well, for a really high-performing policy team, what do we actually need there in terms of the focus that we've got to deliver? And then, because I like quadrants, you can also start to think about in relation to the different skill sets, and this is not done scientifically at all. You can debate where things sit in these quadrants, but when you're at that high-performing end and you really are a policy entrepreneur and a leader in your policy community, you're certainly involved with the citizen focus, reframing issues, you're adept at giving free and frank advice, commissioning is superb, and you are a steward of the policy system. So that's aspirational, but that's what's helping to inform the way in which we're thinking about the skills that we need to bring that supplement the very important stuff that we already do very well. So this leads us, and this is my final slide, so I'm tracking slightly ahead of the time frame I've been given, but that'll leave a little bit more time for questions. This has led us to think about a capability maturity model, and it's a capability maturity model that will hopefully enable us to, across our policy teams, benchmark the capability that we've got, and whether it's at more of a developing stage or how mature it is. And then we anticipate we can scale the model that we draw up for individual policy teams to a system-wide model, and we can start to look at the capability maturity of policy advice right across the system. So there's some ambition there, but I'm going to, this just highlights the different components of that model. So I'm going to leave it there